So today, in my home locale of Canada, a dark-skinned man with a handkerchief covering or scarf covering half of his face, who was reported to have dark curly hair, opened fire at a Canadian soldier standing ceremonial guard at a war memorial, wounding the soldier. The soldier has since died after being shot, of course, at point-blank range. The shooter then walked to the Parliament building in Ottawa, Canada, where he opened fire inside before being killed, reportedly shooting between 10 and 30 times. What are we to make of this squaring off, of this, and you could say, gaining of wisdom or loss of innocence for Canada as a whole? Well, there is a war at the moment between the West and Islam. And the war goes back to very, very deep historical roots in committing attacks against Western countries, such as 9/11 and so on. In putting forward these repulsive medieval beheading videos, the goal of these extremists is twofold, and you can't really lose either way. Number one is to cause a withdrawal of Western military power from Muslim countries. Number two, of course, is, if that fails, to continue to provoke the Western powers into escalating their violence against the Islamic countries until such time as the Western countries run out of money and thus withdraw their troops from Islamic countries, withdraw their military influence. This has a long history. It's so important to understand the both sides in a conflict really need to be understood. And of course, most people in the West, which we'll get to in a second, have a good understanding of the Western position on the Islamic or the Muslim position. The Muslims, of course, have been ruled and divided and handed out like party favors among the Western powers for certainly since the early parts of the last century. And they have seen two significant waves, I guess three significant waves of imperial withdrawal. Now, of course, the dominant presence in the Middle East is America, and to a smaller degree Britain, and of course through sales of arms and weaponry, Israel. Now, they're not going to get Israel to withdraw, but they can focus on bankrupting the Western powers through this continued war of attrition. It's far more expensive to invade than it is to wage a war of attrition, and therefore, in the long run, the invading power always runs out of money and has to withdraw. So this is the basic reality of the conflict. And it may be not coincidental that as the imperial powers withdraw from the conflict, specific actions are taken to provoking them into re-engaging. So Canada ended its mission in Afghanistan in March of this year. So maybe there's a reason to goad Canada into re-engaging. America, of course, scaled back its involvement in Iraq, and so now they're back in Iraq, and the goal is to get them to re-engage. You have to keep, if you are waging this war of attrition against an occupying force, you have to keep them engaging until you bleed the treasury dry. Well, of course, the American treasury is long dry, as is most of the Western treasuries, because they're off the gold standard, but the reality is there's so much debt that until you simply can't pay the soldiers anymore, until you simply run out of money to fund your imperialistic fantasies, you continue to get the Western powers to re-engage. And that, of course, is the purpose. In Canada, of course, the tragedy is going to be that there is going to be significant if it turns out that the shooters are Islamic or radicalized or Muslim or something like that. And we, in fact, will hold this video until this determination is made. And we're going to assume that it is and release it when this information comes out. The tragedy is going to be that there's going to be a renewed call for let's go get these guys, let's go bring these killers to justice, let's go do this, let's go do that. And the only thing that will happen is further debt and erosion of civil liberties in the relatively formally free countries in the West. This is the tragic outcome of this. Now, there will, of course, be massive politically correct cries to not succumb to what is called Islamophobia. You always have to worry and be very, very skeptical when people put forward arguments with the word phobia or gate in them. Gamergate. And so phobia, of course, is one of these irrational words that denotes, the rational word denoting irrational perspectives. And to what degree is it irrational to have concerns about an Islamic or Muslim population in your country? Well, around a third of young British Muslims favor killing in the name of Islam, according to a survey released by WikiLeaks, publication of US diplomatic cables. A US diplomatic cable from January 2009 quoted a poll by the Center for Social Cohesion as saying 54% wanted a Muslim party to represent their worldview in Parliament, and 40% want Muslims in the UK to be under Sharia law. 12% of young Muslims in Britain believe that suicide attacks against civilians in Britain can be justified. 1 in 4, 25% of Muslims support suicide attacks against British troops. From 2007, 26% of younger Muslims in America believe suicide bombings are justified. 35% in Britain, 42% in France, 22% in Germany, and 29% in Spain. 25% of British Muslims disagree that a Muslim has the obligation or an obligation to report terrorists to police. 1 in 5 Muslim students in Britain would not report a fellow Muslim for planning a terror attack. 68% of British Muslims support the arrest and prosecution of anyone who insults Islam. As was recently quoted in the Bill Maher show, 78% of British Muslims support the arrest and prosecution of the newspapers in Europe which published Mohammedan cartoons. 35% of Canadian Muslims refuse to repudiate Al-Qaeda. 62% of Muslims want Sharia law in Canada, and 15% say make it mandatory. So that's not particularly compatible with the multi-millennia development of the separation of church and state and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on, that has literally on the bodies of tens of millions of Westerners been built as an edifice that is one of the great glories of human civilization. It really is astonishing. This is not a tiny group of radicalized Muslims. There is significant support, 25%, 35%, 45%, depending on which questions you ask and what you measure, significant support for radical destructive terrorism in the Islamic community in the West. And this is something which cannot be sidestepped. And therefore, it is not fair to say that it is merely Islamophobia that has people having concerns about these communities in the West.